Hey, Lily. Well, all things considered, I'm in quarantine, but other than that, life is good.
I am talking to you from Grand Junction, Colorado. So it's on the western slope, about 30 miles from the Utah border. So it's all the way on the other side of the state from Denver, on the other side of the Rockies. And what about yourself?
I'm in Seattle, which a couple of weeks ago was like America's Wuhan, but people have been surprisingly consistent in the way that they've obeyed the instructions about sheltering in place.
It's really lovely to be in this situation here where I live. I feel very fortunate just because there are hikes, trailheads like 10 minutes from my house in a national park. So I'm lucky that I'm able to distance myself even when I'm recreating. So should we hop right into the some climate discussion?
Sure, I'd love to get a little bit more insight into how you're viewing all of this.
Well, so when I found out that I would have the opportunity to talk to you, I do want to preface this with my birthday is on Earth Day. So, yeah, so it works out perfectly. And funny enough, we've always celebrated Earth Day in my house along with my birthday. This is such a wonderful and cool opportunity for me to be able to talk to the founder of my birthday.
One of the things that we've always taken pride in with Earth Day is a great many of the days that are set aside to acknowledge something important in American society, Labor Day or Veterans Day or Easter or Christmas. You kind of lost sight of what it was really all about initially, honoring workers, honoring people who gave their lives or made sacrifices for the country. But then it has turned into something where we use it for sales. There's the Labor Day sales, there's the Easter sales, for Earth Day, we've managed not to have that happen. I've never heard of an Earth Day sale, but now I hear that every Earth Day you receive a bunch of presents. You're commercializing our holiday.
I do. I'm so sorry. My apologies. I receive at least 4 Hallmark cards every Earth Day. Well, and our joke is like, it's Lily's Earth Day. But it's actually part of the reason why, I started to be sort of involved in, environmental issues. And granted, I've always lived in Western Colorado. From where I'm sitting, that direction east, which is on its way to Denver, there is the biggest flat top mountain in the world and a national forest. To the west, behind me, there is the Colorado National Monument. So it is another national park. And then about 30 minutes-ish to the south of me, there is Gateway. There's there are plenty of other things if you were to go further, Black Canyon, all these other national parks. And then north, there are the Book Cliffs and other public lands. So I have been surrounded by the environment kind of my whole life. I was raised here. And having my birthday on Earth Day definitely exacerbated my interests in the environment. So, thank you for making my birthday so special.
It was a period in my life, actually one of the best periods of my life, when I was in the Carter administration. I was the director of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Colorado. So I went hiking and cross-country skiing through many of the places that you were just describing, and as you talk about them, I can still see them in my mind's eye. It's a wonderful part of the planet. The climate emergency is breathtakingly complicated, both in its causes, its impacts, and its solutions. And you're still a teenager. I mean, how in the world did you get so involved in an issue this complicated at such a tender age?
So a couple years ago, some students had formed a group called Grand Valley Students United. Most of them were seniors. And that was actually based in the March for Our Lives movement. And then as the group developed, and as, I joined, some of my peers joined, we sort of started to develop a coalition of students who wanted their voices to be heard on multiple different issues. Really what we've done with our environmental platform is we had a student head a fundraiser for Protect Our Winters. We've been involved in the planning of every single climate strike and climate event here in the Grand Valley. And all of that really stemmed from, I think my understanding that climate change is a very urgent issue because there's nothing really tangible that you can see, and I did feel that way for a long time. I was hoping that would be some sort of tangible proof so that people would understand that there is a crisis going on, and it's just so widespread and almost vague that people can't really understand and grasp it unless they have a large breadth of understanding. Young people's voices are the voices that need to be heard right now. And two, it's disproportionately affecting minority communities as well. And what I really hope for, and one of my career goals and life goals, is to eliminate some of these issues that are disproportionately affecting minority communities. And what I want to do with my privilege is be able to try and fix some of those issues. It's also been a lovely way for me to sort of focus where I want to go in my career, because I would like to go into politics, and so making sure that people are represented properly and accurately, and that a constituency is truly represented. I think climate change is a big part of that issue.
It's remarkable that someone, again, at your age, recognizes your privilege. I don't know you need to feel guilty about it, but to understand that it brings with it a set of obligations, and to make sure that you're doing your very best to pursuing a more just and equitable world for everyone. That needs to be an essential, inherent part of all environmental progress, I think, is that it be shared widely.
I would love for you to talk a little bit about how you have been involved and how long you've been involved, and kind of the things that sort of catalyzed your work.
Like you, I grew up in a spectacularly beautiful part of the planet, the Columbia River Gorge. And as I was growing up, was a little bit of a loner. I used to go out on bicycle rides up the gorge and go out on camping trips and hiking through the summers. And there were these wonderful old-growth forests in the Gifford Pinchot and Mount Hood, and I got to know them fairly well. And would go back a year or two later, and there would be a massive clear-cut that just stretched miles and miles and miles that had turned it into a landscape with vast erosion. And in the town that I grew up in, it's a small paper mill community where basically everybody worked for the mill, or worked for something in a grocery store or a drugstore that somehow serviced the people who worked in the mill. That was at a time when there was no kind of pollution control whatsoever. So the smokestacks poured out sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide, which, just elementary chemistry, if you mix them with a little bit of water, you've got sulfuric acid and sulfurous acid, and you get a little bit of water in Camas, Washington. I guess it rains 2 You're there.
Just a little bit.
So it would pit the roofs of the cars, and it would destroy the roofs of our houses, and we would breathe it. And somehow that was normal. And some of the workers would take a high degree of pride in it. That's the smell of progress. That's the smell of prosperity. Somehow I had this sense from a fairly early age that it should be possible to make paper without destroying the planet. I took off and attended a National Science Foundation ecology seminar after my junior year in high school. And we studied all sorts of things, but mostly it was how animals interrelate with their environment and do things that are positive and things that are negative, and how the feedback loops cause them to do less of the negative and more of the positive. And over time, as that developed, a few years later, after my sophomore year in college, and a period of incredible Weltschmerz as I was looking for meaning in life, I went out and hitchhiked around the world for 3 years. And by the time that I had returned home, I had basically made a commitment, although we didn't have a vocabulary back then to describe these things this way, but that I really wanted to apply my life to bringing principles of human ecology, urban ecology, industrial ecology, and apply them to the human experience. And so from the age of about 21 on, I knew what I wanted to do with my life and was just looking for opportunities to do it.
Earth Day has been really incredible for people to sort of understand, the importance of climate change, or the relevance of climate change in people's lives, environmental conservation, and all of those sorts of issues. Why do you feel that creating that awareness and creating a day to kind of focus on it is so important in making change?
I mean, but in 1969, the air in major American cities, in Pittsburgh and Chicago, Gary, Indiana, Los Angeles, was then very much like the air in Beijing or New Delhi or Mexico City. Then we had a few studies that came out that showed that simply breathing in a place like Los Angeles was the equivalent of smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. And then suddenly it hit particularly young mothers that their 2-month-old babies were smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. And suddenly there's outrage, and this is just not acceptable. And you're able to move from awareness into activism. And that's a really big shift, but you don't get the activism until there's the awareness. It's one of the problems we've had with climate. You see a 1,000-year flood coming every 3 years, and you realize there's something that's new that's going on here. But until you get the awareness that ties into that background factor of the pouring of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that's leading to this, that awareness is necessary before people will get out in the streets and start demanding change. Which leads me to a question. Making that shift from being aware of an issue to taking action on it. Everybody thought that I was quite young when I was involved in organizing the first Earth Day. But I was 25. And now we have, basically kids who are 16, 17 years old leading major demonstrations in streets. How did you make that transition?
Well, I think part of it was my prior lobbying experience, just because it had opened my eyes. It opened my eyes to how I, as an individual, could influence the passing of legislation itself. I had worked with an organization called Arts for Colorado, and I actually had a connection through my lovely mother, as she was on the board at the time. And so they hosted a lobby day, and I was a freshman in high school interested in politics. She brought me along with her, and then I met their lobbyist and sort of was able to see, at least here in the state capitol, exactly how bills are passed. I've since testified in multiple committees, and been on multiple lobbying trips for different issues in different organizations. And I think that is what made me believe that I could continue to influence policy. But I think that really that is what has made me understand that I can drive policy as a 16-year-old. Because even though I'm not of voting age, I am still a constituent. And so, us organizing as a united front as young people, I think is even more powerful. And of course I've been told I'm too young. I've been told it all. and I do live in a very conservative community. Here in Western Colorado, it's one of politically the reddest areas in the state. We've gotten quite a bit of blowback for all of the different things that we've done as Grand Valley Students United, and even our West Slope Youth Vote program, which is nonpartisan, doesn't have an agenda. We've still gotten blowback for being too young. To me, part of it's representation, and the other part of it is just my understanding that I can drive policy because I'm a constituent, I'm a citizen, and I am worthy of being listened to, even if it's, even if what I have to do is organize with other young people who care, and bring out the community and unite the community. How did you mobilize other young people around you when the social paradigms were not, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel that they were not as progressive, and aggressively forward as they are today?
Movements for profound change are almost always led by the relatively young. I mean, the anti-war movement was young people. The civil rights movement was young people. The environmental movement in this country was young people. And a few years ago at Tiananmen Square, it was all college students. The riots in Hong Kong are young people. Arab Spring was young people. It just goes on and on. Part of it is that when you're young, you don't yet know what can't be done. So you go out and do it. Your parents may have been trying, and after a while you sort of tend to give up. For me, the world is not going to change spectacularly before I move out from this orb. I'm now in my mid-70s, and I can see that there is only a limited tunnel ahead of me, but you're looking at least 70 or 80 years out ahead of you, during which time the world can change spectacularly, either for the better or very much for the worse. And the earlier you get started, the better. As people were saying with regard to the coronavirus, it's like a forest fire. If you move very swiftly, you can control it relatively easily. If you don't, then farther down the path, it becomes almost impossible to control. I think that analogy applies to the climate crisis every bit as much. We had, by the time we started organizing around environmental things broadly, I mean, there have been environmental things before that, against the Santa Barbara oil spill, against the use of DDT and pesticides, to try to stop freeways from going through inner city neighborhoods. But they were slices. They weren't dealing with a broad set of values that tied significant groups of people together on a common front. By the time we started doing that latter, weaving all of these different strains together into the fabric of modern environmentalism, we were coming out of a decade of great activism, and we spent a fair amount of effort pulling people from those earlier movements into the environmental movement and taking advantage of their skills. So we talked a lot about Agent Orange and other defoliants in Southeast Asia as environmental issues. We talked about lead paint and rats in ghettos and freeways cutting through vibrant inner city areas as environmental issues, trying to draw, with some success, all of those previous activists and make them part of this broader movement. But what we didn't have, which you have, and this is something that's sort of baffling to somebody my age who's still trying to become accustomed to the digital revolution. We didn't have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp, TikTok, Snapchat, Messenger, other things out there. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have computers. We didn't have cell phones. So for us, organizing over great distances was really hard. I mean, the direct communication was you would write something, put it in a mimeograph machine, run off a few hundred copies, stick them in the mail, and 5 days later somebody on the other side of the country would read it, because you just didn't have enough money in most of these organizations to spend that much time on telephones. Whereas if you really were trying to broadcast something to a broad audience, or the way that you can now with social media, that always had to go through an intermediary. You had to convince some reporter that what you had to say was worthwhile. That person had to convince his or her editor. They would take your words and write it up, and then somebody else would edit it. And by the time that it got out, it generally bore some relationship to what you were trying to say, but wasn't really exactly what you wanted to say. Whereas today you get to communicate it directly in your own words, and if there's something that is ambiguous, it's your mistake. You get a chance to communicate directly, and I think.
And what's also really interesting is that, you know, depending on there's a lot of factors, but depending on how you use it, how you separate your different networks on social media, you can really create different effects. So, you know, for example, my Facebook, a lot of it is work focused. A lot of people my age, frankly, don't have Facebook. It's considered the older people social media. And I have it because, one, I'm able to connect with, you know, older people who I work with. And it's a great tool for me to push out events to, you know, our older population. And Grand Junction is actually a big retirement community. So a lot of that is work focused. And then my Instagram is really mostly personally focused. And you know, the things that I post on there are wildly different from what I post on Facebook. And so those who I've connected with on Instagram are mostly people I know personally, friends of mine. And so separating those networks, you know, I'm then able to maybe share. Recently, I shared the same graphic on both my Facebook and Instagram of, you know, me with the two other climate strike leads. And I got, you know, responses from students who I never thought I would. You know, how can I get involved?
Let me get serious here for just a second. I mean, one of the issues that really worries me a little bit about your generation's engagement with issues like climate change, which are going to be difficult to resolve, There are serious opponents out there willing to spend billions of dollars to make sure that you don't prevail. I mean, how do you sort of view all of that?
And I will say myself and a lot of other young activists or students who are doing this work, we get burnt out. And this was my senior year. I was a field captain in our marching band. So I had to be at rehearsal every day in the hot sun until 4:30 or 5. And then, partway through the year, I had to then go in to school for, our rehearsal for the musical where I was the dance captain and the choreographer. I'm also an IB student. Some of the students I work with are IB and AP students. So, big, heavy, very rigorous course load. And we're doing college applications, scholarship applications. So that's us kind of looking out for ourselves. And then on top of that, we're doing all of this work and being fought against by, these huge lobbies like oil and gas with billions of dollars to spend. And I think mental health, especially here, actually in our valley, we have a very high teen suicide rate. We have one of the highest in the nation. It's kind of the same group of active students that do everything. I've done well for myself. I take care of myself. And I'm very adamant about, so kind of figuring out my priorities has definitely made a difference. But I've known students who have had really deep mental health issues. They're doing all of these other things that they have to do to get into college to even start their career, plus being fought against, these industries that are just out for money. If you are able, you could go and get a therapist, or you could, go and seek mental health help. But a lot of those resources, one, cost money, and two, it's hard to approach a parent about that when, for example, a parent has been like, well, you need to be less busy, because these are things that we deeply care about. And so it's hard to look out for yourself and then look out for your entire generation at the same time. I also make sure that I am spending enough time with the people that I love, whether that's, friends or my family, because I think if I didn't, I would just go crazy. But I have known students who've just been so busy, they feel that they don't have time for their friends, and so then they don't prioritize friendships. I will say my friends who I don't work with, and I'm very close friends with most of the people I work with, they're at every women's march, every climate strike, everywhere I'm speaking, and they're there to cheer me on because they share my beliefs, which is wonderful.
It sounds like you are taking a much more mature attitude toward all of this than I was at the age of 30 or 35. To set aside time for yourself and to do things that you really enjoy doing and things that involve physical exercise. That just isn't something that was part of my life when I was in my more activist phase. It's really peculiar. I sort of had an assumption that I would live no longer than 50 years. I probably would have taken much better care of myself if I thought I was going to live to 75. I was the class speaker at my graduation at Stanford, and I had been so completely exhausted by the previous 4 months of activism with really no relief at all. We were involved in dozens of issues that were deeply emotional, seizing and occupying buildings, making non-negotiable demands, trying to drive classified research off of campus, trying to disassociate Stanford from the war machine, trying to get more minority professors and students into the university, and so forth. That when I gave that class speech, I afterwards had letters from probably 20 alumni and parents who were all concerned for my health. I looked so haggard up on stage that they were saying, go back, relax a little bit. One of the ways to deal with burnout is by having a vision of where it is that you're going, and to know when you're able to make steps, even small steps, in the right direction, so that you can mount that as clearly progress. What is your kind of best vision for what your world might look like when you're my age?
My hope is that as a country, we no longer depend on industries like oil and gas for economic development, for jobs, and for our energy. That's kind of the basis of Western Colorado. There are many jobs rooted in the oil and gas industry, and I think that it's hard for a lot of the reason that there has been so much blowback, partly for us, and we've talked about it, is that there's so many jobs that, well, my dad's going to lose his job if you try and transition all of this, and the reality, my ideal reality would be that those jobs get gently transitioned into clean energy. But something that's unique to here is the outdoor rec industry. We have college students that will go to school here just to be rafting guides. And so, that's one less student that comes here to get a job, at a fracking rig or, things like that. When I'm 70, I want to see everything running on clean energy. And I think it's attainable. I think we just have chosen to put other things before it. And that is, very frustrating to myself and the other students that I work with.
Mm-hmm. That's a pretty good case. And with something like that, where energy systems and other systems are broadly distributed, and you have non-exportable jobs, and you've got a bunch of other kinds of industries in electric vehicles and in batteries and in solar module manufacturing and what have you that we've brought back to the United States, there are ways to do this for our nation in particular that can lead to a far higher degree of social equity at the same time that everybody is healthier and living in a much cleaner and more resilient and diverse environment.
A developing country on another continent, not in North America, they may not have the luxury of spending a little bit more money on that sort of technology. And so their concern is the direct economic development of their nation and making sure that people can live better with better quality of life. Really how inequitable the idea of, okay, everyone just stop emitting carbon, that's impossible, especially for developing countries, and there are countries who develop completely on export of oil for their economic success.
The big problem with climate change is that elections tend to turn, particularly federal elections, the presidency, the Senate, the House, on a handful of issues. The dominant issue for a very long time now has been, how are we going to be addressing health care? But then there's this wide variety of other issues, and if you get a list of the top 10 issues, climate is probably one of the top 10 issues. In this election, it started climbing to a higher and higher level. The Green New Deal did something to propel it forward. Jay Inslee, my governor, ran for president not with a great expectation of being elected, but with a platform that was, I think, the most aggressive pro-climate political platform that any candidate has ever run for head of state on in any nation. I mean, it was really superb, and it moved the debate. And Elizabeth Warren, after Jay dropped out, she just picked up his platform and ran with it exclusively. Even though, as you pointed out earlier in the conversation, you can't vote, you have some influence over a couple of other people that do vote, and they have influence over a great many other people who vote. It turns out that what mostly determines voting patterns are what people's friends and colleagues are doing. It's the conversations that people have over the dinner table and at the bar and at work. We spend billions of dollars on advertising and other things, and I don't want to say they are without effect, but their principal effect are upon those people who are leaders in their neighborhoods and in their immediate circle of friends, and they tend to be enormously influential. So you're starting a nice little ripple if you're just, beginning with less beef and more vegetables, all the way through the profound transformation of the human prospect by electing a totally different kind of government that I think young people sometimes don't fully recognize the oblique impact that they can have operating that way. Climate is much higher on your agenda than it is on my peers' agenda, and yet as a generation you've got the lowest voting rate in America. Why do you think it is that we're not managing to get people to turn out?
And what I will say, that those same students going to these marches, they're the ones voting. But it's not even close to enough. We have developed what's called our Western Youth Issues Report. So the work that we do is, one is the registering to vote, and the other piece is education. So the registering to vote comes from classroom presentations. Every summer we make this big video, with a different theme. And, this year it was, for example, what's the things that are on your bucket list? All of those things are powered by the decisions your legislators make, so you need to be voting to choose them. And then, so we'll do classroom presentations where we'll show the videos and then register students to vote. And in the state of Colorado, you can pre-register at age 16 or 17 if you have a government-issued ID. So we are registering students to vote, and then we're then having them fill out surveys. I guess that's the third component. We have them fill out these surveys, which we kind of compile into a one-pager. And so the surveys are basically, what do you care most about? What are the issues that you face living in this community? And things along those lines. And then we also make sure that we are passing out this youth issues report. And so it's very similar to a legislative scorecard, but not necessarily rating, how the percentage of how good Senator so-and-so is versus Senator so-and-so. So we really we choose 10 bills every legislative session that are most pertinent to we feel, rural young people on the Western Slope. And then we basically take every single rural legislator and we mark, did they vote yes, no, or were they excused? And then we also have, map of districts and things like that. So really, through this program, we're trying to encompass every aspect of young people being involved in democracy. I think we've shifted young people's attitudes toward voting. There have been people that have asked me questions about voting, that have, talked to me about how excited they are to vote, who I never, ever would have thought were even going to be engaged in politics. And so a lot of them have asked me, where can I find the best information? I want to make sure I'm voting informed. And so I think that attitude has sort of been unique to the Grand Valley, and I know the other programs around the Western Slope, but I think that goes to show that that's kind of what the problem is. We run the program through Western Colorado Alliance. They provide the resources to us because they know that if they were adults coming into a school and saying, hey, come and register to vote, they wouldn't get anywhere near as much engagement, and that peer-to-peer engagement has seemed to have made the most difference. And so I hope that more programs can spring up like that, because otherwise young people, there are just other things that they're concerned about, and I think social media is a part of it. There's stimulus coming from everywhere at any time. You could pick up your phone and something new would be on it at any millisecond of the day. But I think, focusing that energy through peer-to-peer engagement has made the most difference.
And hopefully, in addition to registering, coming back at it a few months later with a Get Out the Vote effort as well.
Yeah, we have them fill out cards, and it's completely optional, but they get extra food usually if they do it, so it's pretty efficient. So we have them fill out cards, and basically, they'll check off, here's why I'm voting. Here, we have a list of issues, and here's why I'm voting. They put their address on it, and we collect them, and they put their birth date on it. And then we sort them, and we have this big file. And so we sort them, and we don't record any of that information. And then we mail those cards back to them right before ballots go out, because we vote by mail in Colorado. You could drop off your ballot too, but we vote by mail. And so we mail them back out, and we do really extensive social media outreach right before each election, even if it's just a municipal election. So we try to cover all of our bases to make sure that we have the best engagement possible.
There's a little story that has largely been forgotten in the mists of history, but it ties into this. After that first Earth Day, we had 20 million people, roughly 1 out of every 10 Americans participating. An event just in New York City that had probably 1 million participants. Mayor Lindsay cut off Fifth Avenue for 40 blocks, and we filled it with people. It was just kind of this extraordinary thing. And then 5 days later, Richard Nixon invaded Cambodia, and the entire anti-war movement suddenly got a new shot of adrenaline, and we started having these demonstrations every place. And a couple days after that, at a demonstration at Kent State, the National Guard was there to control them and shot and killed several students. At which point the environment had completely faded off of everybody's radar screen. It just, we had this massive organization and success beyond our wildest dreams, and then suddenly it was gone. What we did was resuscitate it through politics. That fall, we listed a dirty dozen candidates, and we chose them as candidates who had, for start, terrible environmental records, but that was a very rich pool because a lot of people in Congress at that point had really terrible records. But these were people who had won their previous election by no more than 3 or 4 percentage points, where there was a significant environmental issue in their district, and where we had Earth Day organizers who were prepared to jump in very much like you and your friends are doing and make the transition into actual electoral politics, and were willing to work with us on that. We had very little money. We had $50,000 for the entire United States. And it's really, really hard to beat any incumbent because they tend to raise money more easily than others. They've got great name recognition. There's all these advantages. And we defeated 7 out of the 12 members of the Dirty Dozen. And the very first one to be defeated in a primary was the chairman of the House Public Works Committee, a guy named George Fallon. So this is a really powerful guy. This is a guy that if you wanted to have a federal building, a courthouse, a prison, a bridge, a tunnel, a highway, it went through George Fallon's committee. When George Fallon was taken out clearly by an environmental issue, the number of votes that came for the environment was far more than the margin of victory. That was like the shot heard through the Capitol. So later that same fall, after the election, when the Clean Air Act came up, I should say a piece of legislation that was opposed by the oil industry, the gas industry, the coal industry, the electric utility industry, the automobile industry, the steel industry. I mean, this was not a really universally popular piece of legislation. It was passed universally by a voice vote in the U.S. Senate and with just one dissenting vote in the House of Representatives, showing the power of electoral politics. Let Congress know that this was not 20 million people just out in the parks picking up trash, planting trees, and performing hippie dances. These were people who cared passionately about the quality of life in this country and the direction that we were headed, and were prepared to vote on that basis. If you're coming and you're clearly representing a huge block of voters, then suddenly you will get all the attention that you want, because that's the name of the game.
When we go and lobby and we say, here's your visual manifestation of everything your young constituents care about. We have covered every school, every this and every that. And I think that has made a difference. And while we found that some of our representatives and senators are a little bit more receptive than others, because we have some incumbents and some who aren't quite as willing to listen, we really have made some wonderful connections with our legislators. And what I will say, actually, I would like to mention it by name. Representative Matt Soper, who represents House District 54 here in Colorado. I go to school in his district, but I don't live in his district. He has just been so gracious and so wonderful, so kind. And he, when you talk about partisan politics, he belongs to a party that doesn't necessarily line up with some of the progressive values that, some of us do. And yet he has, sat through discussions and talked to us and come to compromises. So he's a really wonderful example of how to represent a constituency properly.
Mm-hmm. It's good when you can find a person who is an elected politician who has his or her own set of values and will operate on them and not purely in terms of party discipline.
Yes, absolutely. And he's so smart too. So he's very independent.
Back in my day, there were different political parties then than there were now. The Democratic Party had a very, very conservative element. Basically, the South was solidly Democratic, and it was solidly racist. It's what took the New Deal, which was in many ways progressive, and made sure that it was enormously discriminatory. So that mayor of New York who blocked off Fifth Avenue for us was a Republican. The first African-American senator elected at post-Reconstruction was Ed Brooke, a Republican from Massachusetts. And so when we were coming up with this sets of kind of far-reaching environmental laws. I mean, if you look at the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Toxic Substances Control Act, Superfund, on and on. We sent trillions and trillions of dollars in a different direction than they otherwise would have flowed, in ways that are, by the nature of the legislation, all very cost-benefit effective. And they were passed on a bipartisan basis. The Clean Air Act, which is generally attributed to Senator Ed Muskie, a Democrat, John Sherman Cooper, who was the ranking Republican, was a co-equal sponsor and author of the legislation. Unfortunately, that has changed over the times, but I'm delighted that you've got a House member who is willing to transcend some of that party discipline and do the things that he thinks are in the best interest of his constituents. I've got one final question. I think we're kind of running out of time here, but this is a question that I hate whenever anybody asks me, so now this is my chance to get revenge by asking somebody. If there is just one thing that you would like people to do this year with regard to the climate crisis, what would that be?
So, one is vote. I want everybody to vote. I mean, and if I had to pick one, that would be it. The integrity of our democracy is upheld by the decisions made by individuals. But also, I think if I had to, choose another thing, I would like everybody to just be conscious of their impact. Whether that is, taking 10 minutes to learn about carbon credits and that sort of system, or, taking 10 minutes to learn about how you could benefit from having solar energy fed into your house instead of, going through a different energy company. I drive a lot, and my car's not super fuel efficient. I feel better when I'll put in my, through Protect Our Winters, I can put in my destination and where I start, and then it'll, calculate what my carbon cost is. And then, I make that donation to that project every time I have to drive somewhere for work or to go visit friends or, friends in Aspen or whatever it is. And so just things like that, I think, can make a big difference, because if everybody was doing that when they flew, when they traveled, I think a flight that I had found that I was considering taking before all of this had happened, it was only going to be $15 for me to offset my carbon cost. But, to get revenge on you, just out of, my own curiosity, what would be your answer, as an experienced activist?
I hate revenge questions. I think I'd come up with answers that are remarkably close to yours. I'm less a fan of carbon credits and more a fan of actually altering behavior. And to the extent that you can get on a train instead of a plane, great. To the extent that you can walk or bus instead of taking the car, great. And in fact, of course, the most efficient form of transportation that is available to Homo sapiens is bicycle. It's one of the things that religions learned thousands and thousands of years ago, that if you're trying to get people to change their values, the most important way to do that is to get them to change their behavior. And every time they behave in a certain fashion, it's kind of like a reaffirmation of what it is that they care about, stand for. It's the biggest things that have happened on climate in the United States have mostly come out of cities. So urban elections, city councils, mayors, county executives are incredibly important because they have consistently been the leaders. But they've been the leaders because the national government hasn't, and international governments perhaps even less so. I would love to get people elected to office that sign on to the basic elements of what now gets characterized as the Green New Deal. Formidable, bold changes that aren't trying to tweak a little bit with price signals, but are actually through governmental procurement, through regulation, through really strong incentives, bringing about dramatic changes swiftly in the way that the nation powers itself. So what we have to do is very much more like what China did. They decided they wanted to have a good, strong, vibrant solar industry, so they gave all of the necessary incentives to people to gear up very large factories so they get the economies of mass production, and then guaranteed them a market for a number of years for the products that they made. And you need to do that across the board with electric cars. You need to do it with batteries. You need to do it with hyper-efficient buildings. You need to do it with appliances. So I want to get people into office who are aware that this is a crisis that we have dawdled on for 40 years. And this is the year that we've just got to turn it around dramatically. Hey, really, really wonderful to get to know you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a joy to chat with you, and I really hope that we can, continue talking. I think this is a really cool connection. Never in a million years did I think I'd get to talk to the founder of my birthday, and I've learned a lot just through this conversation alone.
And you've helped to reassure me that the world will be in good hands when I pass out of it.
I hope so.